The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass as Danielle Ross pushed through the automatic doors of Oak Creek Memorial's emergency department. Norfolk humidity clung to her scrubs. 2300 hours. Night shift. The kind of shift where most people made mistakes. She didn't. Her badge read D. Ross, RN, with no credentials listed beneath the name. No titles. No honors. Just initials and a surname. That was intentional. The antiseptic smell of the ER wrapped around her like old muscle memory, bleach and betrayal, and the particular copper tint of someone else's blood dried under fluorescent light. She'd walked these kinds of corridors for 18 years, though no one here would ever know that. The smaller hospital in Ohio on her resume didn't exist. The references checked out because she'd arranged for them to check out. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had been officially dead for 9 years, killed in a training accident in 2015 that officially never happened, buried under so much classified redaction that her own mother's death notification had been routed through a Pentagon liaison. Now she was just Danielle. Just a night nurse at a mid-size Virginia Beach hospital nobody famous got sent to. She opened her locker, narrow metal door, the hinges slightly bent from someone's careless slam months ago, and draped her jacket on the hook. Her fingers brushed the inside lining where she'd sewn the patch 14 years ago during a deployment in Helmand Province. Faded now. Desert tan with gold embroidery that caught the light if you knew where to look. SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. She touched it once, the way some people touched crosses or photographs. Muscle memory that had nothing to do with muscles. Her hand was steady when she pulled it back. The nurse's station sprawled across the central hub like a ship's bridge, computers and clipboards and 3 phones that rang in counterpoint to the hiss of automatic doors and the beeping of monitors from the trauma bays beyond. Around her, nurses moved with the particular exhaustion of people who'd been awake too long and cared about things that didn't always matter. They whispered as she passed. She'd learned to hear the silence in their voices, the speculation about the new hire who appeared 6 months ago and never joined them for drinks, never mentioned a family, never asked personal questions, never did anything except her job with the kind of precision that made people uncomfortable. One of them, Rebecca from the day shift, had asked once if she was ex-military. Danielle had smiled, the smile that meant nothing, revealed nothing, and said, "What makes you ask that?" Rebecca had dropped it, but the whisper traveled. By now, Danielle knew, half the staff thought she was military, the other half thought she was just cold. Neither assessment was wrong. Room 314 sat at the end of the East Corridor. She pulled the chart first. Commander James Hayes, age 42, admitted 8 days ago with traumatic brain injury from a training accident. Prognosis, poor. Specialists consulted, neurosurgery, neurology, intensive care. All had noted the same thing in their assessments: extensive frontal lobe damage, unresponsive to stimuli, decorticate posturing, brain death likely within 2 weeks without significant improvement. His left arm lay atop the blanket, and there it was. The tattoo. Block letters, 2 inches tall, ink still dark despite 11 years of sun exposure and seawater, and the particular where that came from being part of the kind of teams that didn't show up in official photographs. Danielle. Her throat tightened. She let it tighten because she was alone in the room and the monitors weren't watching her composure, only his vitals. She'd carried him for kilometers through Helmand Province while rounds snapped through the air like angry hornets and the dust turned the sky into something that wasn't quite earth and wasn't quite hell. He'd been bleeding from a compound femur fracture, his left leg useless, his weight distributed across her shoulders while her own left shoulder dislocated and then reset itself because resetting a dislocated shoulder was something the brain did automatically when the alternative was leaving a brother behind. She'd gotten him to the extraction point. The Black Hawk had come down with rotors kicking up a storm of white dust and he'd been alive, then he'd been in a hospital in Germany, then he'd been recovered enough to get back to the States, then he'd been back with the teams. Now he lay here, vacant eyes tracking her movements with no recognition, no memory of the woman whose name he'd put on his body because that was how the teams marked loyalty, permanent ink, permanent reminder of the moment someone had decided your life was worth more than their own blood. His eyes tracked her anyway. That much the brain damage didn't steal. He couldn't think, couldn't speak, couldn't move with purpose, but something in the deeper reptile parts of his consciousness knew to follow motion. She checked his lines, 4, catheter, feeding tube, with hands that remembered every procedural step and betrayed none of her thoughts. His vitals were stable for now. Oxygen saturation 91%. Heart rate steady. The kind of stability that preceded collapse, usually. Nothing the specialists had done had improved him. Nothing would. The door to the ER burst open with the particular violence of someone confident in their own importance. Danielle didn't look up from the vitals monitor. She didn't need to. She recognized the footsteps, expensive shoes with heels that didn't belong on hospital floors, the kind of heels that announced arrival. Dr. Marcus Sterling. Chief Resident. Silver tongue. The kind of surgeon who'd learned early that charm worked better than competence when you wanted to get ahead. He arrived for his shift every evening at 2300 hours sharp, trailing a crew of younger residents in his wake like iron filings following a magnet. His resident crew called him brilliant. The nursing staff called him worse things, but only when he wasn't listening. From the nurse's station, his voice carried with the particular projection of someone performing for an audience, "I'm telling you, that new nurse they hired last week is already on her way out. Watch her. She's got that quiet intensity thing that screams burnout." He pulled out a money clip, set a $50 bill on the counter with the kind of theatrical flourish that meant he wanted everyone to see. "I'm betting 50 to anyone who thinks she lasts more than 7 days. She walks out crying before end of week. I've seen her type before." One of the younger residents laughed, nervous, eager to please. "How can you tell?" "Because," Sterling said, leaning against the counter in a way that made him look casual, "people who try too hard are always the first to break. No resilience. No fire. Just this cold, going through the motions thing. It's not sustainable." He glanced in Danielle's direction, eyes tracking her like a predator assessing prey. "Give her 4 days. 5 at most." Danielle didn't react. Reaction meant he'd landed a hit. Reaction meant the words had weight. She finished her documentation of Hayes's vitals and moved toward the supply closet, where trauma dressings and 4 supplies sat in organized military rows, 14-gauge angiocath needles, sterile gauze packets, saline flushes, everything alphabetized, everything where it should be. The supply closet was hers now. She'd reorganized it on her second shift, much to the irritation of the day staff who preferred their chaos. The cafeteria tray came later, around midnight. Danielle had gone to grab coffee, hospital coffee, the kind that tasted like burnt adhesive and regret, and on her way back through the main hallway, Sterling was there, moving toward her with the specific trajectory of someone planning a collision. She saw him. She knew what was coming. But she kept walking, tray level, movements economical, and when he'd stumbled, the word in quotation marks because he was far too coordinated to actually trip, his shoulder connected with her tray at the precise angle to send it spinning. Coffee. Turkey sandwich. Applesauce. All of it hit the linoleum floor in slow motion, the plate shattering with a sound like small bones breaking. His residents laughed. One of them actually cried, not tears of sadness, but that hysterical laughter that came from uncertainty about whether they were allowed to find it funny. Sterling had that effect on people. He created hierarchies through humiliation, and the easiest way to climb was to laugh when someone else fell. Danielle knelt without speaking. The hospital floor was still warm from earlier in the day, and the coffee soaked through her scrub pants at the knees, a spreading brown stain that looked like blood in certain light. She had a broom and dustpan in her hands 2 seconds later, someone had left them propped against the wall, and she was sweeping the debris with movements precise enough to be a meditation. That's when Sterling made his real move. He walked past her, deliberately stepped over her kneeling form, and when he reached the nurse's station, he grabbed a patient chart, James Hayes's chart, Danielle would note later, and tossed it back toward her. Not dropped. Tossed. With the kind of trajectory that made sure it landed in the coffee spill. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And maybe pay more attention to where you're going." The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Danielle's hand went still. The broom, 6 inches from the edge of the spill, didn't move. Her breathing didn't change. Around her, the residents had stopped laughing. Even Sterling seemed to sense that something had shifted, because his expression flickered between triumph and uncertainty, the way predators do when they realize they might have miscalculated. She stood. Not fast. Not slow. Just stood, gathering the chart from the floor, brushing wet coffee grounds from its cover with one hand while keeping the other perfectly relaxed at her side. Her eyes met Sterling's, and in that meeting was something that made one of the residents step backward without meaning to. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that he had to be still to hear it. "One day you'll need someone like me, doctor," she said. And then, because she was human and because some things couldn't be contained even with 18 years of practice, a single tear escaped. She didn't look away. Didn't look down. Let him watch her wipe it without breaking eye contact. "I hope for your sake I'm still here." The nurses' station at Oak Creek Memorial fell silent when Dr. Sterling pulled out his wallet. 48 hours into Danielle's first night shift, he stood surrounded by 4 residents and 3 nurses during the tail end of shift change, leather wallet open like a weapon. His voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never had to prove anything twice. $50, he announced, holding a crisp bill between 2 fingers like it was already spent. "Says the new night nurse doesn't last a week." "What's her name anyway?" "Donna?" "Debbie." One of the residents leaned closer, eyes brightening. "I'll take that action, doctor." Sterling's smile widened into something that wasn't quite a smile at all. "Easy money. She's got that look." The ones who think nursing is some noble calling always burn out fastest. They see the reality of this place, they realize they're not cut out for it, and they're gone. Laughter rippled through the group like oil spreading across water, complicit, comfortable, the kind of laughter that only happens when everyone agrees the punchline isn't really funny but the point was never the joke. Danielle walked past carrying a stack of supply requisition forms, her footsteps steady on the tile. She didn't pause. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge the bet being placed on her like she was a horse at Pimlico. The room's attention flickered toward her, waiting for a reaction, a blush, some small visible wound, then back to Sterling when she offered nothing at all. That was the first mistake everyone made about Danielle Ross. They read her silence as meekness instead of what it actually was, discipline. The kind that comes from having learned in places where sound got people killed. 24 hours later, she carried her tray through the morning cafeteria after her shift, coffee that smelled like burnt rubber, oatmeal, an apple she wouldn't eat. Sterling sat at a center table with 6 colleagues, the kind of power huddle that happened every morning after rounds, where the decisions about who was competent and who was desperate were reinforced over eggs and surgical gossip. She had learned by then that the cafeteria was his territory. She'd learned that he preferred an audience. She'd learned that something about her composure, the way she didn't deflate under pressure, the way she carried herself through the hallways like she knew something everyone else didn't, infuriated him in a way nothing else seemed to. As she passed the table, Sterling extended his left leg into the aisle with the casual deliberation of someone testing a river with a stick. The tray angled. Her hands moved to compensate, but the trajectory was already committed. Coffee pooled across the tile in a spreading brown bloom. Oatmeal scattered like shrapnel. The apple rolled under a bench. His table erupted, not quite laughing, but close enough. The sound of it was like a shark's teeth clicking in still water. Danielle dropped to her knees without hesitation, began collecting pieces with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from picking up far worse than oatmeal. Sterling stood over her, his presence making the air pressure change in a way she could feel in her sternum. She was gathering the last of the debris when he dropped the patient chart from room 219 onto the tile beside her hand. The sound was deliberate, a report, a punctuation mark. "While you're down there, pick that up, sweetheart. Room 219 needs actual medical attention, not whatever it is you do." The cafeteria had gone quiet. She'd noticed that Sterling seemed to need an audience for his precision work, the same way some predators need witnesses. Danielle took one measured breath. Then another. She collected the chart without hurrying, stood without looking away from the floor, and met his eyes with a level gaze that seemed to contain something he hadn't expected to find there. No trembling. No redness climbing her neck. No voice crack or visible fracture. Just the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse than this, from having carried men for kilometers under fire, from having held someone's life in her hands when her own was forfeit, from having learned that fear was just information and information was just data. A single tear escaped her left eye. Not from sadness. From the sheer effort of not killing him, right there in the cafeteria, with institutional witnesses and a patient chart as evidence. She wiped it without looking away, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It carried the weight of someone accustomed to giving orders that got obeyed. One day you'll need someone like me, doctor. And I hope for your sake I'm still here. The table went completely still. Sterling's jaw tightened like he'd bitten into something he expected to be soft and found it was bone. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned back to his eggs without responding. That was the second mistake. Responding would have meant acknowledging that something had shifted in the room's gravity, that the nurse he'd placed a bet against wasn't going to crack like he'd wagered on. That silence was worse than any comeback he could have offered. The nickname started during rounds. The Phantom, Sterling called her when she was out of earshot, his voice pitched for whoever was within 10 feet of him. The Phantom doesn't socialize, doesn't talk about her past, probably has bodies buried somewhere. His residents laughed because it was Sterling, because he was laughing first, because the hierarchy required it. He planted seeds of doubt the way a toxicologist plants poison, small amounts, consistent timing, invisible accumulation. To the charge nurse, her resume is suspiciously vague. Military background, she says, but won't specify where or what she did. Flag that. To the nursing director in the hallway, I'm not saying anything definitive, but I'd run a deeper background check before she handles anything classified. To the other attendings, you ever notice how she never speaks about herself? That kind of secretiveness doesn't build trust. By the end of the week, the doubt had taken root. Not suspicion yet. Just the kind of ambient distrust that springs up when a powerful person consistently suggests something's off about someone. Danielle had been assigned the worst cases, the terminal diagnoses, the unresponsive patients, the ones that went to her because no one else would take the assignment. Commander Hayes in room 314 had been placed in her care with Sterling's voice echoing behind it, "Let sweetheart handle the vegetable in 314. She seems to like lost causes." The name was meant to diminish her. Instead, it locked her into position. It gave her access. It put her beside the man whose name was tattooed on her left forearm in block letters she'd inked herself with a needle and ink in a compound in Helmand Province 12 years ago, after he'd survived what he shouldn't have, after she'd carried him, after everything had been classified and buried and she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life like she'd never been born at all. His eyes were closed. His chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance from a ventilator that wheezed its rhythm like an animal sleeping restlessly. She moved through the room in her clinical rounds with the kind of precision that came from years of training in field medicine, from learning that 1 millimeter of deviation during a field procedure could mean the difference between a patient going home and a patient going into a body bag. Her hands organized his charts with perfect spacing. Her movements around monitors and fall lines were economical, elegant, nothing wasted. She took his vitals with the kind of careful attention that suggested she already understood exactly how much time he had. A resident passing the doorway noticed the precision, noted it somewhere in the back of his mind as thorough, and thought no more about it. He didn't recognize it as the mark of someone trained by the Navy to perform combat medicine under fire while people screamed and rounds snapped overhead. He didn't see the unit patch she kept sewn inside her jacket lining, small enough to hide, old enough to be faded beyond legibility to anyone who didn't already know what they were looking at. The fluorescent lights above Hayes's bed hummed their constant frequency. Outside his window, Norfolk's darkness pressed against the glass like something alive, waiting. At 0200 hours, the alarm screamed. Not the soft warning tones of a monitor notifying nurses of a trending decline. This was the shriek of a patient in acute decompensation, the kind of sound that brought people running from every direction. Danielle was first to reach room 314. She was always first, positioned with an attention that no one attributed to anything but diligence. Hayes was thrashing against the ventilator, his body arching like something was trying to claw out of his chest. His jugular veins distended, standing proud against the corded muscles of his neck. His lips had gone grey. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 88, 82, 76, and the blood pressure was collapsing like a building condemned. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid crushing his heart. She called the code without touching the phone. A resident materialized in the doorway, then another, then Sterling in scrubs he'd yanked on over street clothes, his hair still holding the shape of sleep. "Get me a thoracotomy tray," Sterling barked, already moving toward the bed like he'd been born ready for this moment. "We need to crack his chest and find the bleed." The resident scattered to comply. Danielle's voice cut through the chaos like a wire. "Doctor, this is tamponade. He needs pericardiocentesis, not surgery." Sterling whirled on her, his eyes going flat. "I didn't ask for nursing advice. You want to practice medicine, go to medical school, sweetheart." His voice was ice. Around the bed, 3 residents froze, uncertain whether to continue assembling the thoracotomy instruments or wait. Hayes's blood pressure dropped, 70/35, oxygen sat 64 and falling. The ventilator's alarm was a constant scream. Sterling's hands fumbled slightly with the thoracotomy setup, the kind of hesitation that comes from not having done this particular procedure in years, from trusting the idea of it more than the reality. Danielle made her choice. She moved to the supply cart with the kind of smooth economy that came from muscle memory, pulled the pericardiocentesis kit, prepped the insertion site just below the xiphoid process with antiseptic that smelled sharp and chemical. Sterling's voice rose, "Step away from that patient." She didn't. Her needle found the pericardium at the angle between the ribs and the left shoulder. She advanced until the flash of blood-tinged fluid painted the hub, then aspirated, steady pressure, one smooth motion, 180 milliliters of accumulated blood releasing pressure from Hayes's heart. His vitals responded immediately. Blood pressure rebounded, 95/60, then 110/70. The monitor's alarm silenced. The oxygen saturation climbed. His body went still on the bed, breathing with the ventilator instead of fighting it. Sterling's face went the color of old concrete. "You just practice medicine without a license. You're done here. You'll never work in this hospital again, you'll never work in this state again, and I'm going to personally ensure you never work in medicine anywhere." His voice was quiet, which made it worse. The residents stood frozen, uncertain whether they'd witnessed a miracle or a crime. Danielle pulled up a chair beside Hayes's bed, sat down with her hand near his wrist, watching the monitors like she was the only thing standing between him and whatever came next. "I'm monitoring him for the next 4 hours. His pericardium could reaccumulate. Someone needs to watch him." Sterling leaned close, voice deadly quiet. "You won't be here in 4 hours. You won't be here tomorrow." Then he was gone, leaving the residents to their thoracotomy instruments and their uncertainty and their slowly dawning realization that they'd just watched something they didn't have a framework to understand. The night stretched ahead, long and measured, like all the nights Danielle had kept watch before. The alarm screamed at 0200 hours like nothing Danielle had ever heard outside a battlefield. Room 314 erupted in chaos, monitors shrieking, ventilators cycling into a desperate rhythm, the unmistakable sound of a man's body beginning to fail. She was already moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory taking over like it always did when the stakes climbed above the line between stable and catastrophic. The fluid around Commander Hayes's heart was crushing it. Cardiac tamponade. His chest filling with blood that his pericardium couldn't accommodate, pressure building, oxygen saturation plummeting from 94 to 87 to 79. One breath away from arrest. 3 residents stood frozen at the foot of the bed. New ones. Good intentions, terrible instincts. They looked at Sterling like he was scripture, waiting for orders that made no medical sense. Thoracotomy, he was barking, "Get the surgical tray, crack his ribs, we're opening him now." The words tumbled out of Sterling's mouth with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong and therefore could never be corrected. His residents nodded, reaching for instruments they didn't need, preparing to butcher their way into a problem that required precision, not violence. Danielle didn't ask permission. Didn't raise her hand. Didn't do any of the things that kept night nurses invisible and compliant. She simply stepped into the space between Sterling and the bed with the quiet authority of someone who had made life-and-death decisions in sandstorms and mortar fire. Her voice dropped an octave. "Step back." Not a request. The residents flinched away from the bed like she'd snapped a command. Sterling's face went purple, the kind of rage that comes from being contradicted in front of an audience. She ignored him completely. The pericardiocentesis needle was already in her hand. Muscle memory. 18 years since Helmand Province, and her hand still knew this procedure better than they knew how to rest. She prepped the skin with antiseptic, the sharp chemical smell cutting through the panic in the room. The ultrasound probe showed her what she needed, the fluid collection around the heart, the compressed chambers, the anatomical roadmap that meant the difference between life and another body for the morgue. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. 2mm adjustments. She found the window between the ribs, positioned the needle at the xiphoid process, angled upward toward the left shoulder. She didn't hesitate. The needle slid through the skin, through the intercostal muscle, through the pericardium with a sensation that lived somewhere between resistance and surrender. And then the hiss. The unmistakable sound of air escaping pressure. 180 milliliters of blood-tinged fluid rushed into the collection syringe, crimson and thick, each milliliter a heartbeat. Hayes was getting back. His oxygen saturation climbed. 82, 87. 91, the monitor rhythm steadied from the desperate flutter of tamponade into something that resembled actual cardiac output. The color returned to his lips. His skin, which had been the shade of wet concrete, began to pink beneath his jaw. "Get cultures," she said quietly. To no one. To everyone. It wasn't a suggestion. A nurse she'd never spoken to before moved toward the lab station without question. The residents watched her like she'd just conducted a resurrection. Sterling stood in the doorway with his mouth open, his authority evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge the way his hands had balled into fists or the vein pulsing at his temple. She pulled a chair close to Hayes's bed and sat down. Our one stretched like taffy. She monitored his vitals with the kind of obsessive precision that had kept her alive in places where distraction meant death. Vitals every 15 minutes. Temperature climbing incrementally, 101.4 degrees. Then 101.9. Her fingers moved across the medication cabinet with the muscle memory of 1,000 shifts, broad-spectrum antibiotics per standing sepsis protocol. 2 grams of ceftriaxone 4. She knew the dosages like breathing. She knew the contraindications like her own heartbeat. A second-generation nurse approached her quietly, whispered. Sterling called the nursing director. "Said you assaulted him. Violated protocol. Used an unauthorized procedure." Danielle nodded once, didn't take her eyes off the monitor. Temperature 102.1. Heart rate steady at 78. She adjusted Hayes's oxygen flow to 6 liters and continued her vigil. Hour 2. Hayes's oxygen saturation dipped to 89%, not critical, but a signal that something was shifting in his lungs. Fluid accumulation. Infection beginning to establish itself in the spaces between his alveoli. She repositioned him, turned his body weight from his right hip to his left, performed chest physiotherapy with hands that knew exactly how much pressure would mobilize secretions without causing pain. And then his eyes flickered. The first real sign of neurological improvement in 6 weeks of unconsciousness. His pupils tracked her face. Not recognition, the blank stare of someone emerging from a long sleep without memory of the descent. But his gaze held hers for a moment, and in that moment his left hand shifted against the hospital blanket. The tattoo appeared. Block letters on his forearm, faded but still visible. Danielle. She had carried him for kilometers through Helmand Province with that name still wet on his skin, blood on both their hands, fire raining down from 3 directions. Now he was looking at her like she was a stranger. Her composure didn't crack. It wasn't a mask, it was the only thing keeping her functional. She checked the monitor, heart rate steady, blood pressure holding at 118/75. The medications were working. The sepsis protocol was working. Her presence was working. Hour 3 brought the collision she'd been anticipating since she pulled the needle from his chest. Sterling returned with Barbara Chen, the nursing director. Chen's face carried the careful neutrality of someone who had already made a decision and was simply executing the paperwork. They didn't come to congratulate her. They came to remove her. Ms. Ross, you're ordered to leave this floor immediately pending investigation. Please surrender your badge and equipment. Sterling stood behind Chen like a shadow with teeth. Danielle stood slowly. Her legs were stiff from sitting for hours without moving, muscles locked in the kind of immobility that came from refusing to abandon a post. She checked the monitor one final time. Heart rate 78. Blood pressure 118/75. Fluid draining. Infection markers dropping. Hayes was stable. Stable meant he would live. He's stable now, she said quietly. Her voice was a different instrument now, flat, controlled, the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to fear. I'll go. She stood, and Sterling's hand came up, reaching for her arm like he could stop her through sheer force of will. She stepped past him without acknowledging the gesture. As she walked toward the exit, she heard him on the phone before she'd even cleared the doorway. Fragments of conversation drifting after her, credential verification. Ohio Hospital, board members need to know, employment records, no paper trail. His voice was climbing, losing its surgical precision, becoming something more desperate. He was already strategizing her erasure the way she'd strategized emergency medicine minutes earlier. With the same clinical detail. The same absolute certainty. He had no idea that he was trying to erase someone who had already been erased once by the Pentagon, that the Ohio hospital existed only on paper, that the employment records he was trying to verify had been scrubbed by people with access to classification levels he couldn't imagine. Hour 4 complete. In the locker room, she pulled off her scrubs and sat for a moment on the wooden bench with her forehead in her hands. Not crying. Senior chief petty officers didn't cry. They processed. They calculated. They moved forward. She reached into her locker and touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only proof that Senior Chief Danielle Ross had ever existed outside of a classified file and a dead man's tattoo. The promise she'd made 18 years ago was breaking. Stay invisible. Stay buried. Stay alive. The first 2 had been simple. The third had required watching a SEAL commander die in a hospital bed while doctors stood frozen and made the wrong choice. She had broken her own directive, stepped into the light, saved a life that was supposed to stay dead to her. Outside, Norfolk dawn was breaking in shades of grey and amber. The parking lot was empty except for her truck and the security camera that had captured every moment on the 3rd floor. She didn't go home. Home was a studio apartment with military-issued furniture and no photographs, a place where ghosts were more real than neighbors. Instead she drove north toward Arlington, toward the man she'd promised to forget, toward the grave where another senior chief petty officer lay buried under a different name. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It brought federal law enforcement to Norfolk before Sterling's last phone call had even been transferred to the state licensing board. But she wouldn't know that yet. For now, there was only the sound of her truck engine and the certainty that she had just ended the illusion of her own safety. The truth was walking toward her. And when it arrived, it would arrive in uniform. By 9 in the morning, Dr. Marcus Sterling had made 6 phone calls. Each one was a thread he pulled with the precision of a man who understood institutional power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. The first call went to Gerald Hutchins, board member and retired cardiac surgeon, whose son Sterling had mentored through residency 5 years ago. "We have a liability situation," Sterling said into his office phone, voice low and grave. "Nurse on our night shift. Practicing beyond her scope. Questionable credentials. Patient endangerment. He let that hang. I documented everything. But we need to move fast before the union gets involved. Hutchins promised to call back within the hour. The second call went to Patricia Vance, another board member with investments in 3 healthcare systems. The union will fight any termination unless we build a documented case, Sterling explained, his tone suggesting shared burden. I need your support. I need paperwork showing performance issues before we escort her out. Vance, accustomed to protecting assets rather than questioning motives, agreed to back him. Sterling smiled. This was how leverage worked. This was how power accumulated, not through direct force, but through a series of phone calls to people who owed you favors and people who wanted to owe you favors. At 9:17, he called Chen, the nursing director, with a different tone entirely. Respectful. Concerned. I hate to bring this to you, but I have to. The new night nurse, Danielle Ross, there have been incidents. Medication administration discrepancies. Insubordination toward physicians. Patient families uncomfortable with her bedside manner. He paused, letting Chen process. I documented what I witnessed personally. Thought you should know before this escalates. Chen, who had already heard whispers from other staff, felt the pieces click into place. By 9:25, she was building her own file. The third call was to a Virginia State Board of Nursing investigator Sterling knew from a continuing education course, professional acquaintance, nothing that would look suspicious in a phone log. I'm concerned about a practice scope violation, Sterling said carefully. A nurse on my unit performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. Needle decompression of the pericardium. The procedure was life-saving, which complicates things, but the legal question remains, did she exceed her licensing authority? The investigator took notes. An emergency procedure that saved a life was harder to prosecute, but the question itself would open a file. At 9:40, Sterling called the hospital's legal team. I need verification on a nursing applicant's credentials. Danielle Ross. The employment history she provided, I want confirmation that everything checks out. Something feels off. By 9:50, the legal team was preparing a verification request. The final call came at 9:58. Sterling had pulled the phone number from the staff file, a rural hospital in Ohio where Danielle claimed 3 years of ICU experience. He requested the HR department. The voice on the other end was tired and efficient. Danielle Ross? No employment record exists for that name in our system. Never heard of her. Sterling closed his eyes. He had suspected. Now he knew. By 10:15, Oak Creek Memorial Security was escorting a woman in scrubs toward the employee exit. Danielle carried only her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, a piece of history that no one could see. She had been notified of suspension pending investigation into credentialing fraud and scope of practice violations. The paperwork had been prepared with unusual speed. Immediate suspension. No badge access. Criminal referral possible. The day shift watched in silence as she walked past, eyes forward, jaw set. No tears. No anger. Just the precise, measured pace of someone accustomed to following orders she didn't agree with. The rain started light, then intensified into something biblical by the time she drove out of the parking lot. By noon, it was hammering the city like percussion in a funeral march. She drove north on I-395, muscle memory carrying her toward Arlington, toward the rows of white stones that marked the boundary between the living world and the one she had promised never to return to. The mud was thick when she parked, clay-based Virginia earth that sucked at her shoes as she walked. Section 60. She knew the route without checking. She had walked it 100 times. The headstone was simple. No rank. No medals. Just a name and dates. Jacob Michael Ross, 1980 to 2013. Lieutenant, United States Navy. Beloved husband. The words were inadequate for everything he had been, but they were what civilians were allowed to say. Below the stone surface lay a man who had held her steady through Helmand Province, who had whispered tactical adjustments while blood pooled under his ribs, who had died 3 months after they got him on the helicopter because some wounds were too deep to close. She knelt in the mud. The rain was cold. Her scrubs were soaked through. Her hands were steady, which meant the breaking was happening somewhere internal, somewhere no one could measure. "I broke my promise, Jake." Her voice was barely audible. "I surfaced. I couldn't let another one die." The words came from a place that hadn't spoken in 6 years, since the day she had agreed to bury her identity, to become someone new, to let the world believe that Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross had been killed in a training accident along with 18 others. Dead women tell no tales. That was what the briefing officer had said. That was protocol. You existed only in classified files after that. You existed in redacted memos and encrypted channels. You did not exist in the world where your husband's stone was exposed to rain and moss and the slow work of forgetting. "The operation stays buried," she whispered. "Our team stays buried. But I couldn't, not again. Not him." Lightning illuminated the cemetery, turning the white stones luminous, turning them into teeth in the mouth of something that swallowed people whole. "They're going to find out I don't exist. Everything we did, everything we sacrificed, it's going to unravel." She pressed her forehead to the cold marble. It was wet. She couldn't tell if it was rain or tears. She had learned long ago not to distinguish between the two. She stood alone. The rain continued without mercy. She walked back to her car, leaving footprints that would be erased in minutes, leaving no trace that she had been there at all, which was how she had learned to exist, which was what they had trained her to be. The classified operation in Helmand Province had been buried with 18 other secrets. Official story, training accident. Actual story, ambush, 7 men down, impossible extraction under sustained fire, a senior chief who carried 2 of them alone through 4 kilometers of contested territory while her own blood mixed with theirs and her mind stayed as cold as a sniper scope. Navy Cross in a ceremony that officially never happened. Record scrubbed. Identity erased. Sent back into the world as a civilian with no military history, no rank, no family except the husband who had already been dead for 3 years. She didn't know that at 11 in the morning, Commander Hayes' daughter Emma had made her own phone call. She didn't know that a manila file was being prepared. She didn't know that the truth was moving toward Oak Creek Memorial with the precision of a military operation, that by noon tomorrow the silence would be broken by the sound of rotors, that by 1 o'clock, people would begin to understand what they were actually standing next to. She sat in her car in the rain, which continued without pause, without mercy, without witness. The seat was soaked. Her hands were on the steering wheel. Her eyes were fixed on the rows of white stones behind her, on the grave of a man who had loved her enough to die so that other people could live, and on the uniform she would never be allowed to wear again in public, the rank she would never be allowed to claim, the truth that would destroy everything the moment it surfaced. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had known, 6 years ago, that this day would come. That surfacing wasn't a choice, it was inevitable. That some debts came due regardless of how deeply you buried them. The rain fell heavier. Somewhere in the city, a man was making his 7th phone call, and he didn't understand that he was counting down to the moment when the entire weight of classified operations, of honor codes that transcended uniforms, of debts owed to people who had no names, would come down on his head like an anvil. The Black Hawk descended through Norfolk's afternoon haze at 1,100 hours, rotors beating the air like mechanical thunder, shaking the hospital's windows hard enough that furstands trembled in patient rooms. For men in dress Navy uniforms, blue so crisp they could cut, moved through the ER doors with the fluid precision of apex predators, their presence making the air pressure change, making the fluorescent light seem dimmer by contrast. The lead figure wore the shoulder boards of a Master Chief, his chest a constellation of ribbons that told stories classified people never discussed. He walked straight to the nurse's station and spoke for words that stopped every conversation mid-sentence. "Where is Senior Chief Ross?" Dr. Sterling materialized from the back corridor, his face already composing itself into the smug arrangement of someone about to deliver a termination speech. He stepped forward, hand extended as if he were welcoming distinguished guests rather than about to humiliate them, ready to explain that the nurse in question had been terminated for credential falsification, that hospital protocol demanded, but his voice froze mid-word when a 12-year-old girl pushed past the nurse's station clutching a manila folder so thick it bent under her own weight. Emma Hayes, the commander's daughter, her jaw set with the same military precision as the men beside her, her eyes red-rimmed but steady. Behind her, a younger nurse, Ashley, the one who'd stayed to help during the pericardiocentesis, reached for the folder with trembling hands and began to read aloud, her voice climbing with each sentence, 3 bronze stars. 2 with Valor. Combat Action Ribbon. Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. And, she paused, her voice breaking slightly, Navy Cross. Date classified. Ceremony classified. All operations classified. The room went dead silent. Not a whisper. Not a breath. Just the steady beep of monitors and the fluorescent light's faint electrical hum. Sterling's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. The Master Chief moved 2 steps closer, and Sterling instinctively stepped back, his heel bumping against a desk. The Master Chief's voice was calm, which somehow made it worse than shouting, "I am Master Chief Petty Officer Derek Garrett, Naval Special Warfare Command." Senior Chief Ross pulled 7 men out of Helmand Province, including Commander Hayes in that bed right there. She received the Navy Cross in a ceremony that officially never happened because the operation was classified above top secret. She was ordered into deep cover by Naval Intelligence. You don't get to fire her. You don't get to question her. You don't get to exist in the same building as her. He paused, let that settle, then added 2 more words that turned Sterling's face the color of old concrete, escort him. What happened next changed everything. Sterling's hands began to shake. He looked at Emma, at Ashley, at the Master Chief, at the 3 other SEALs who were now moving with purpose toward the administrative wing. His voice climbed an octave. There's been a misunderstanding. Hospital policy requires verification of credentials, and her application clearly stated, Master Chief Garrett cut him off with a look that could have carved steel, her credentials were scrubbed by Naval Intelligence. What hospital policy requires right now is that you tell me where she is. Now. Sterling stammered something about suspension pending investigation, standard procedure, board support, his words tumbling out faster and faster like a man drowning in his own incompetence. Emma stepped forward, her voice small but absolute. You called her sweetheart. You made her pick up papers off the floor. My dad told me. The crowd shifted, uncomfortable murmurs rippling through the gathered staff. Nurse Ashley spoke next, her voice steady as surgical steel. He knocked her cafeteria tray over. I saw it. Everyone saw it. A third voice, Dr. Patricia Chen, an attending who'd worked alongside Danielle for weeks, added, I watched him make her clean it up while his residents laughed. Sterling's voice rose to a shout, this is irrelevant. Hospital policy was violated, and I have board support. I have documentation of her credential falsification. I have, his phone rang, cutting him off mid-sentence. He looked at the screen, saw it was board chair Patricia Vance, and his entire body went rigid. He stepped aside, answered with a voice that had lost all its venom, Hello, Patricia. Her voice came through loud enough that the Master Chief heard it, Marcus, what the hell is happening? I have a Navy Admiral on my other line asking why we fired a decorated SEAL. Gerald just called me in a panic. Fix this. Now. The line went dead. Sterling tried to dial Gerald Hutchins. Voicemail. Then the hospital administrator. Voicemail. Then the chief medical officer. Voicemail. The walls weren't just closing, they were collapsing inward, a physical force that made Sterling's breathing shallow, desperate. That afternoon, desperation took the shape of a crime. Sterling accessed Danielle's personnel file using his administrator login, opened the digital documentation, and began to alter it with the careful precision of a man who believed himself clever enough to outrun evidence. He added a box checked for no military service. changed her previous employer verification status to confirmed when it had never been verified, backdated a performance warning he'd never actually filed, giving it a timestamp from 3 months ago. His hands moved with the jerky precision of someone who knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyway, believing that if he could just prove fraud on her application, the entire military connection would become irrelevant. Fraud was fraud. Policy was policy. He saved the changes at 1,445 hours, took a breath, felt a moment of twisted relief. He didn't know that Oak Creek Memorial's electronic record system had been upgraded 6 months prior with FBI-grade audit trails following a Medicare fraud investigation. Every keystroke was logged. Every alteration was flagged, timestamped, tagged with his user ID like a signature written in digital ink. The hospital's compliance officer received an automatic alert at 14:47. By 14:50, the chief information officer was reviewing the logs. By 15:05, they were making a call to the FBI field office in Norfolk. By 1600, federal agents were examining the evidence, 14 separate alterations, each one traceable to Sterling's login, each one a federal offense under the healthcare fraud statute. By 1800, they had the warrants drafted. The phone call came at 18:30 hours, Special Agent Melissa Morrison's voice precise and professional. "Dr. Sterling, this is Special Agent Morrison, FBI Cyber Crimes. We need you to remain at the hospital. We're en route with a warrant for your arrest." The FBI arrived at 1,900 in 3 unmarked vehicles. Special Agent Morrison and 3 other agents met Sterling in the hospital administrator's office, where they laid out the evidence like cards in a hand he'd already lost, 14 alterations, each timestamped, each traced to his login, each one a federal felony. Falsifying documents in a facility receiving federal health care funds. Obstruction of a federal investigation, because yes, they told him, this had been flagged as a potential national security matter the moment Danielle's clearance was mentioned. Morris looked at him the way a surgeon looks at infected tissue. "You tried to bury evidence on a Navy SEAL with a classified file. You did this in a hospital receiving federal funds. You're under arrest for federal document falsification, obstruction, and healthcare fraud." They read him his rights at 1920. They placed handcuffs on him at 1925. They perp-walked him through the emergency room at 1930, his dress shoes clicking against the tile floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown, the sound of a career ending with each step. Every staff member who'd watched him torment Danielle for 3 weeks watched this moment. Nurse Ashley whispered to another nurse, "Good." A resident looked away. Dr. Chen simply nodded, once, a gesture of acknowledgement and closure. 2 years later, someone who'd worked at Oak Creek Memorial spotted a man selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a Virginia Beach strip mall near the oceanfront, his medical license permanently revoked, his federal conviction making him unemployable in any position that required a background check or a shred of professional credibility. The man's name had been Dr. Marcus Sterling. His suit looked bought from a clearance bin. His smile, when it came, carried the desperate energy of someone selling something nobody wanted. Inside Oak Creek Memorial's ICU, on a Saturday morning drill weekend, Senior Chief Danielle Ross stood beside Commander Hayes's bed wearing her Navy dress uniform for the first time in 7 years, dress whites, ribbons displayed openly across her chest now, her rating badge and trident gleaming under the hospital lights. Hayes was sitting up, physical therapy having brought him back further than any neurologist had predicted possible, his brain injury resolving like fog burning away from a harbor. His eyes were clear. They tracked her movements with recognition, with memory, with the kind of understanding that comes from having survived the unsurvivable together. He looked at his left forearm, at the tattoo rendered in block letters, Danielle, and his right hand rose slowly, trembling slightly, to touch the ink. "I remember," he whispered, his voice rough from weeks of disuse. "Helmand. The fight. You wouldn't leave me." His daughter Emma sat in the corner, smiling through tears. Danielle's hand came to rest briefly on Hayes's shoulder, a gesture that carried the weight of classified operations, of debts owed in the darkness, of honor codes that transcended every uniform and every regulation. She leaned down, her voice steady and quiet. "Welcome back, Commander." She turned to leave, and Emma's voice followed her, "Senior Chief?" "Thank you." Danielle paused at the door, glanced back at Hayes, at Emma, at the room where she'd surfaced and saved a life and torn away 7 years of careful burial. Her voice came out measured, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of a senior chief addressing her crew. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." She walked out, past the nurse's station where her photograph now hung on the wall of excellence, a classified image from a ceremony that officially never happened, her uniform, her trident, her presence finally visible to the world. She passed the ER where Master Chief Garrett had told her story to a silent room. She walked through the doors and back into the Virginia afternoon, into the world where she could finally exist as herself, where the faded unit patch that had lived inside her jacket lining for 7 years could finally be displayed without the weight of secrecy crushing it down. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever carried a secret that cost you everything, hit that subscribe button. Comment below, what would you have done in Danielle's position? And if you believe the quiet ones are often the strongest, like and share this story with someone who needs to know they're not invisible.